Hello and welcome to another episode of my extended exploration into the origin story of Joy Division. Now, I've been out of the country for a few weeks and I'm just, as you can probably hear, getting over a cold. Straight away, dealing with the subjects of Joy Division and in particular Ian Curtis, we're going to be touching on subjects of mental ill health and ultimately mortality. So take this as a trigger warning. It's unavoidable with the subject. I'm sorry, I'll try not to dwell on things. Now, in the last episode, talked about the physical environment that the members of the band grew up in. There was a sense of loss at the centre, the heart of the Mancunian experience at that time. All communities had been ripped apart, replaced with warehouses and wasteland. These new buildings were unnatural. They were made of parallel lines, shapes that don't appear in nature, artificial spaces. And these spaces don't only have their own distinctive visual feel, they have their own sound. Reflections on hard surfaces go on forever, and our brains can hear when there's a regular pattern. They can hear when the surfaces are man-made, they're artificial. And for me, it was one of Martin Hannett's masterstrokes as a producer with Joy Division to incorporate kind of unnatural sounding spaces into the production of the records. The results kind of end up in a uncanny valley between what you feel a band should sound like and your experience of, like, they're almost ambient records in that they simulate the space around us. And this went completely against what production was at that time in rock music, which was mainly to reproduce the sound of a band in a room, and Hannett refused to do that on principle. Now, I talked about his production techniques in my first video on the band, which you can find here. But in short, he took digital devices and used them to mimic impossible spaces. These synthesized spaces evoke strange feelings. The term liminal space is going to be something of a meme over the last few years, and like the word meme itself, that's come to obscure what the actual concept of it is. In internet parlance, it's usually used to refer to vacant spaces with an uncanny aura. Typically a hallway, a corridor, a derelict commercial unit. Images of these places remind you of places that you've been, but ones that weren't impactful enough to make a full memory. So the overall effect is a little disconcerting. They remind you of somewhere you've been. There's a feeling of deja vu. I feel like I've been here before. But liminal spaces are not always physical. In fact, most aren't. The ones we experience most often aren't. A liminal space is one of transition. It was originally coined as an anthropological term used to describe the period of initiation that young men undergo in tribal societies to be respected as adults. In many of these societies, boys show their worth through tests of endurance and strength. They live outside of the village for a period of time, both physically and psychologically. So this space that they inhabit is liminal. And a similar thing happens when you leave school and you go into employment. In the UK, those who especially leave school before doing higher exams and going to work enter a kind of liminal space. They're not They're not kids, they're not adults. You know, the hallways aren't full of other children. They're now just full of your own footsteps and things that you need to lift around. All the people around you are testing you, making fun of you. You're in a lonely place. You're sitting alone at lunch, there's isolation. So being in a liminal space causes anxiety, there's uncertainty, and humans don't like uncertainty and the feeling without being controlled. These are feelings that people of all ages experience all the time. The members of Joy Division all made this transition into the adult world. The no fun, do what you're told lad, coldness. Day in, day out. Day in, day out. Structures of school have been replaced by something new. A new order, if you'll pardon the pun. Teenagers sitting in jobs are very often finding themselves sitting in adulthood's waiting room. This causes a deep separation from day-to-day existence. Why should I respect this job if you don't respect me? That's something at least a million teenagers have at least thought. You can take your franking machine, etc. Bernard Sumner had this to say: when I left school and got a real job, real life came as a shock. My first job was in Salford Town Hall, sticking down envelopes, sending out rates. I was chained in this horrible office every day, every week, every year, with maybe 3 weeks holiday a year. The horror enveloped me. So the music of Joy Division was about the death of optimism, of youth. Learning to adapt to social norms. It involves questioning who you are at the most central level. And this liminal space between childhood and adulthood is what gave birth to the punk movement. Young people, adolescents, people under the age of 20, just even more the unemployed than the employed, felt disenfranchised. They wanted a culture that spoke to their experience, so they created one from scratch. And the end of the 70s in itself was an uncertain time. It was a time of change. Mainstream culture was neutered and anodyne. There was unrest on the streets, and the Cold War always loomed overhead. So, rather like today, the members of Joy Division grew up in turbulent times, times of change. And times of change are just one of the liminal spaces that we occupy during our lives. One of the things that add more anxiety to our lives. The pandemic was probably the best example of a liminal space that caused an existential crisis for just about everybody in the world. And it's one we're still seeing the effects of play out. A sense of doubt, to quote a Bowie title, induces anxiety. There's a grief for what's gone. There's sometimes a dread for what might be to come. Liminal spaces in all their forms cause anxiety. You can feel it in your body. Your nervous system craves certainty. The transition to adulthood through work is just one example of a liminal space. Marriage and breakup are two others, and Ian Curtis in particular inhabited both of these and more liminal spaces. Curtis's life was short but remarkably turbulent. He experienced great critical success and the respect of his peers, though money was tight. This in itself was a liminal space. He was lauded yet penniless. He was waiting for his bank account to match those column inches. Though he married very young, Deborah was not his first girlfriend. He'd had a relationship when he was about 14 that left him absolutely devastated. Being dumped seems to me to be the inciting incident of his origin story. It was at that time he started to write seriously. He'd carry about a bag full of scribblings from place to place, separated into lyrics and novel. towards the end of his marriage, Curtis experienced breakup from another angle, this time with the excruciating idea of losing contact with his daughter, the daughter that he wasn't even allowed to hold unsupervised because of his epilepsy. All of these are nearly states, a kind of transition, and these states of transition always cause anxiety in us. There's no reason to be surprised that Ian Curtis was affected so tragically as regarding his mental health. His epilepsy was just one of the crosses that Ian Curtis had to bear. Up to 1970, at that point in the English Church of England, the word epilepsy was enough to stop a marriage ceremony. And it was still regarded very much as an insanity rather than an illness. Now, epilepsy itself is not completely understood nowadays, and now is not the time to go in depth on the subject, and I am not medically qualified to do so. That said, it can be kind of understood as a malfunction of brain's circuitry. For whatever reason, the system becomes overloaded and needs to do some kind of reinitiation, which could be merely needing a rest, or it could be going into a full fit, which involves seizures and movements. Very often people who undergo seizures have a pre-seizure, a lighter attack beforehand, which is called an aura. They might experience odd smells or sensations. There's an intense feeling of déjà vu. It's the same kind of feeling that those liminal spaces invoke in our brain. Now, it's been speculated that these patterns of brain activity are associated with religious experience, that a lot of the prophets from throughout the ages suffered from them, or were afflicted by them, or whichever word you want to use. Leaders like Julius Caesar and Lenin, artists like Van Gogh and Gershwin, all are speculated to have had and experienced seizures. It seems that Ian Curtis kind of willingly entered these states as a kind of ritual, and it does leave a bit of an unsettling question about how much he was using his persona, and really, is there a voyeurism when we're watching it? Are we the ones in the Atrocity exhibition paying to watch his body twist? Curtis placed his fragility centre stage. He could hardly be accusatory of the audience for watching him, as he would have watched at the same time. But he was very divided about how he felt about it. There's a letter he wrote in 1980 to a friend saying about, I'm afraid to go out because of a condition. I don't want to go and have a fit in a club or cinema. I get more nervous when we play now. It seems more frequent. I don't think I could ever sit on stage again if I ever had a full stage attack while playing. But of course, by that stage, he'd already had many attacks on stage, and there was, of course, that dance. So it's been much speculated that the way he moved was a way of sublimating the seizures, codifying them into activity that he could control. Many of his trademark moves are in fact symptoms of a seizure themselves, namely kind of head turning, odd postures, what could only be called a kind of jerkiness to the movements. His wife claimed that this was the way that Ian Curtis danced at weddings and so on, and that as early as 1972 he'd report having sensations of floating, as if he'd taken drugs without actually taking them. He called these to flashbacks, and I think there's no doubt he harnessed this quality in his artistic representation of himself. Probably doing this was unavoidable for him. He meant it completely. According to Deborah Curtis, again, he would stay up long after concerts knowing that an epileptic attack was coming, knowing he was going to have a seizure. The gig, the stimulation of doing the gig by itself would have been enough of a trigger were it not for the flashing lights and the way that he involved himself so much with the performance. Epilepsy is involved with depression in kind of a complicated way. It can be tied up with brain chemistry. It could be tied up with the circumstances of being afflicted by the other condition. But both of them are similar in the way that they're kind of a malfunction of brain circuitry. There's something going on in there, and it's manifesting itself through not working in the most desired way. That's a massive oversimplification of what is a very complicated subject. It very often runs in families, but what we do know is that Ian Curtis had no history of mental illness in his family, but he did have a lot of conflicting pressures. He was a father, he was a husband, he had a band who were relying on him. And probably his depression came out of all of these things, and including other influences such as the medication he was placed on by doctors. Now, there was a lot less of an understanding of what epilepsy actually was in those days. And so the medications that were used with people who had seizures were very often quite a lot serious. And one of the backbone of Ian Curtis's treatment was a drug called phenobarbital, which he used to suppress his seizures. Now, the side effects of this drug can include agitation, nightmares, psychotic disturbance, thinking out of normality, anxiety, hallucinations, dizziness. And none of this would have been improved by the fact that he drank heavily, by the fact that he didn't get a good night's sleep, by the fact he was under so many different kinds of stress at any one time. There were flashing lights, there was a pressure of being a confessional writer and putting himself completely on display. There was the guilt of what was happening in his personal life and the way that his marriage was breaking up. Something had to give. And so he dipped into mental illness. Now, this from an early draft of Love Will Tear Us Apart is painfully honest. It's lost its appeal in these regressive days. Can't function for long in this depressive haze. Depression's a liminal space in itself. You're apart from the world. You're existing in this place, but not much more. You're neither dead nor alive. And in the 1970s, medical treatment of depression was again a lot more primitive than it is today. And the drugs that they used often caused more problems than they solved. See, there's a flattening of effects with a lot of psychiatric drugs that ends up with the sufferer of depression being very flattened out. They don't see the horror of the world anymore, but they don't see the joy either. It's a lonely place. And I think you can hear the transition, the difference in Ian Curtis' voice going right from the RCA recordings in 1978 through Unknown Pleasures and on to Closer. There's an increasing detachment in his voice. Now, he was officially diagnosed with epilepsy in January 1979, and 2 months later, his daughter was born, and that was during the recording of Unknown Pleasures. His medication schedule changed many times over those last 18 months, and it's probably fair to say that his body won't have known what hit it. He was taking so many chemicals. What he probably needed more than anything was rest and recuperation, which unfortunately, as we know, he never got. Instead, Curtis placed himself on display completely. His lyrics were confessional. Everything laid bare, even the depths of his metastasizing mental health problems. It's often uncomfortable to be a voyeur to his very public breakdown. And all of this is in a spooky, deserted space. And it's this hyper-real honesty that for me is why Joy Division's music still resonates, and I think does with younger generations as well. The kinds of spaces we inhabit have only really changed cosmetically. Adolescence is still a time of transition, and often this transition can be traumatic. You know, having to conform never gets easier, and most of us also experience things like breakups at various times. The Surgeon General of the US recently issued a report on our epidemic of loneliness and isolation. Our fractured lives compound all these feelings. And so there's a kind of catharsis in the music of Joy Division. Hearing this uncertainty for the future articulated, I think, is reassuring. And so one of Joy Division's greatest contributions to music, in my opinion, again, was the articulation of complex emotions. This was no longer just about boy meets girl or I'm angry. As Tony Wilson put it, Joy Division changed the content of the message from fuck you to I'm fucked. All these complex emotions ring true to us now because of how naked they were in the delivery. Yet they're tied to imaginary spaces that couldn't exist but seem redolent of where we spend our times in this post-industrial space. Our workplaces are probably made of parallel lines and walls. They probably have these same kind of acoustic properties. They're spaces that sound strange if you clap your hands. They're unnatural, they're artificial. We're a part of those spaces and they're a part of our lives. Okay, so that about wraps it up for this episode. Thank you for watching. As ever, if you enjoyed this episode, press the buttons, like, subscribe, all that business. Sharing is caring. Leave a nice comment. I'm aware that this episode has maybe been heavy going because of the themes that it involves, but I promise the next one will be more uplifting. But believe it or not, we're actually going to be dealing with happy chappy Karl Marx. But we'll be talking about the ways that Joy Division fought against alienation and the normal ways that we're meant to work. So we won't be dwelling on the dark side. This is going to be a lot more of an up episode. Thank you for watching. Take care. See you soon. Bye.